Masha Hammerly, and this is my talk, Hiring is Not Hazing. And if you want to tweet at me, I go by _Thagomizer on Twitter, and I love tweets. So let's start with the obvious. Interviews suck. I've read so many blog posts, Twitter threads, Facebook rants, etc. about how much interviews suck. And I'm going to assert, tech interviews, they suck more. I've thrown this out on Twitter a couple times for discussion, and the anger people have around tech interviews is astounding. But you know what? I think we can do better. This talk is going to go over a number of things that I believe will improve interviewing in tech. And some of those are small things that you as a single interviewer can do. And some of them are larger, and they may require buy-in from your manager, your legal team, or maybe your HR team. I'm also going to state right now that most of these things are opinions. Some of this is based on research, but I haven't fully sorted out what is research and what is opinion, so just assume it's all opinion. And that opinion comes from the 100+ interviews that I've given and the dozens I've done as an interviewee. But first, let's address the elephant seal in the room. I work at Google. Google is infamous for their interviews. Trust me, I know. I failed my first 3 rounds of interviews at Google, and they were not pleasant experiences. I wouldn't have even tried the 4th time if I hadn't been in a mental place of, well, I don't have anything to lose, and if a friend wasn't literally cheering me on the whole time. I think I can safely say that Google's interview process doesn't work for most people. And as a hiring manager, and quite frankly, as a person, that frustrates me. And a lot of that frustration is what motivated me to start organizing my thoughts in this way and building this talk. But let's make it clear up front, I haven't fixed Google interviews. I'm trying, but it's slow going. But I do believe that I have made the 45-minute interviews that I spend with candidates slightly better since I started following these tips. And a lot of this is stuff I learned from others at Google who actually give pretty pleasant interviews. So let's dig in. Whenever I ask people about tech interviews, one of the first things they object to is how we assess technical skills. So that's where I started. What are the different ways of assessing technical skill and which one is best? So whiteboard coding, traditional way to assess technical skills, and people hate it. But we still do it a lot, so there must be some good reasons for it, right? Well, the pros of whiteboard coding are pretty obvious. There's lots of existing prep materials. You can literally buy books for some of the bigger companies on how to ace the insert company name here interview. It's also pretty inexpensive for the company to execute. You need one person's time and either a whiteboard or in the age of COVID, some sort of shared document. And it doesn't require much time. You're in and out in 45 minutes, and then there's another hour or so for the candidate to the interviewer to type up their feedback. The cons, everyone hates it. And actually, everyone's a bit of an exaggeration because I actually like whiteboard interviews, but I acknowledge the fact that I'm a freak. It's also not realistic, and it's really hard to assess objectively. And those two kind of go together. Nobody actually codes on a whiteboard. You have an IDE and a compiler that tells you when you mess stuff up. And people assess whiteboard interviews very differently. Some people get really upset about syntax errors. Some people only are there to assess your thinking process. But since you're assessing it that way, it's really hard to do it well. And then the primary reason I think people hate whiteboard interviews is interviewers just ask really bad whiteboard questions. So next most common technique I've seen for assessing technical skill is some sort of homework challenge. Many folks say this is significantly more fair because it's more realistic. And you get to use your tools and references. You're actually writing code on a computer to a task. It's kind of like how a lot of developers work day in and day out. Another nice thing is that you can give problems that take more than 45 minutes, and a lot of people prefer those because they tend to be a little more realistic or similar to what you do at work, as opposed to things that tend to be a little more abstract or simplified. Cons, this is super duper hard for folks with any sort of caretaking responsibilities or things that they do in the evenings and on weekends, because setting aside 4, 6, 9, whatever it's going to take hours in a place where you're not going to be interrupted is hard for a lot of people. In fact, I'd say it's hard for most people with any sort of caretaking responsibilities or any responsibilities outside of work. It's also really hard to help folks who misunderstand a question. I've worked at companies that use homework as a way to assess folks before, and a not insignificant percentage of the responses we would get back, the candidate just completely misunderstood the question and spent a bunch of hours on something that wasn't actually what we were looking for, which was really unfair to them and kind of made me sad, because if they had been in the office, we could have nudged them in the right direction. And then the other big thing is most homework questions take way, way too long. I've heard from multiple people that they spent 9, 12, 14 hours on a homework assignment. You don't need that, trust me. It's just too much time for someone to dedicate to your process. And it's usually a screening thing because you're going to ask them to come and spend a day on site anyway afterwards. It's just too much time for a screening process. So this is another one I've heard recommended a fair amount by some of my communities, and those are the ones that tend toward pairing anywhere. You bring someone in for a day and they just shadow one of your employees. They pair with them on their programming assignments. They may, go to meetings with them and take them out to lunch with the team. Basically, a day in the life of an employee turns into the interview. And I've been offered an interview like this, but I actually had to turn it down. So there's a lot of pros here. It's really realistic. They get to do the job for a day. It also allows you to see if the candidate works well as part of your team and part of a team because they're working with other coworkers. So you get to see how they, bounce ideas off each other, if they can share ideas, if they can, take feedback and criticism well. And it's much less prep for the interviewer because all you got to do is show up at work that day and be nice to someone. There's a lot of cons though, and I don't think people actually sit through and think through these very much. First of all, I personally believe there are ethical issues around asking someone to work for you for a full day and not paying them for that. A lot of companies address this by actually paying folks for their day on site, but there's also potential issues then around non-competes or anti-moonlighting clauses in a contract. And this is actually the reason I wasn't able to take an interview that was come spend a day with us, is because my contract didn't let me be paid for it. It's intimidating for a lot of folks. I also didn't want to do the interview because the idea of spending a day around a bunch of people I don't know in a completely unstructured environment that I couldn't prep for at all, that scared the bejesus out of me. And it's also hard to pick a task that's consistent and fair. The only way you can really make sure that everyone who's interviewing for a position has the same experience is if you do the same exact coding problem with them over and over again, and then you've got one of your folks who's going to be doing a toy problem, and we're back to some of the problems with both homework and whiteboarding. So GitHub, I've seen a number of folks say, hey, just look at their GitHub to assess their technical skill. I largely see this from people who have a very impressive GitHub. I'm going to actually take it a little bit broader and say this is actually just a form of portfolio review. And basically, portfolio review is just ask the candidate to share some of the work they're particularly proud of and then probably discuss it with an interviewer or a bunch of interviewers. This is a standard part of interviews in many creative fields already. So your company, if it's relatively large and hires designers or artists or other similar folks, they may have an ability to do this type of thing already for some roles. But again, there's pros and cons. The pro of this, and the reason I actually like it a lot, in some cases, it allows you to candidate to choose what they show you. So they can choose just their best work to show off. It's also, again, much less prep for the interviewer. You just have to show up and be curious. There's a lot of cons though. The biggest one is that many folks can't share code from their previous jobs. In design type fields, frequently what they're sharing are UIs or advertising campaigns. There's stuff that's already out in the public, so there's no real concerns about them sharing it with a future employer. It's there. Not the same thing for source code. The source code for a lot of the stuff we work on is private. It's under copyright by your previous employer, so you can't actually share it. And then people are like, well, just show your open source contributions. This is coming back to the same issue with homework. A lot of folks don't have a lot of time for open source. They have caretaking responsibilities, they have hobbies, they like doing stuff other than coding in their off hours. That's fine. The idea that you have to be coding all the time to be a good programmer is antiquated and was never actually true. And then the other one here, and this is a kind of meta point as well, is that it's hard to differentiate between the absence of a signal and a bad signal. And what I mean by that is it's hard to differentiate between a candidate who just doesn't have any code or a lot of code that they can show you and a candidate who can't code, or a candidate who has no code that they can show you, or who can't code or who writes bad code. So lack of signal would be the candidate just can't show you code, but they're actually good at coding. And the bad signal would be they can show you code and the code is bad, or they can't show you any code anyway because they don't have any. So hard to differentiate between the absence of a signal and a bad signal. So which of these is best? Answer E, none of the above. They all have pluses and minuses, and no matter what you pick, it won't work for someone. So basically everything's awful and we should just give up and keep doing what others did to us. No, of course not. That would be a very, very short talk. So when I got to this point where I realized that just switching the way we gave an interview wouldn't actually help anyone, and that, maybe we could offer folks a choice, and I do think that's a good option. But if all of these methods have pluses and minuses, there has to be something more going on here. Because if one of these methods was clearly better, I would notice that in the started analyzing them. So I started looking at it a little more closely. Here are some generalizations of stuff I've heard. So I hate whiteboard interviews. The CS201 stuff isn't relevant to my job. Fair. I hate homework problems. The last one I did took 8 hours. Also fair. I hate pairing interviews. I don't know anything about the company's domain, or I hate having to do work for a company when I come on site. They aren't paying me, and I don't want to work for them unless they've actually hired me. I've heard whiteboard interviews are so unfair. So what if I miss a semicolon on the whiteboard? And interviews all suck. It feels like the interviewer just wants to show off and look smart in front of the candidate. Yeah, lots of nihilism here. But if you squint a little and take a step back, it turns out that for most folks, it isn't just the method of the interview that made it hard. It was something more fundamental about how the interview happened. That's why I've highlighted the second half of all of these statements here. The CS201 stuff isn't relevant to my job. Okay, well, if the whiteboard interview didn't use CS201 stuff, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Or I hate homework problems. The last one took 8 hours. Well, maybe if the homework problem didn't take 8 hours, it wouldn't be so bad. Or I hate pairing interviews. I don't know anything about their domain. Well, what if you brought someone on site and paired with them on something that didn't require domain knowledge? Maybe the pairing interview wouldn't be so bad. Whiteboard interviews are so unfair. So what if I miss a semicolon? Well, maybe if you didn't take off points for the semicolon, it wouldn't be so bad, etc. So what I noticed here is that there's some stuff that's generalization. First of all, we ask bad questions. The CS201 stuff, the homework problem that took 8 hours, asking the candidate to do something in your company's domain when they don't know it. Those are bad questions. Second of all, we do a bad job of evaluating. Again, if you're taking off points for a candidate not knowing your domain, you're most likely not assessing the candidate fairly. And I'll come back to that in a second. And if you're taking off points for a missing semicolon in a whiteboard interview, I'd argue that you're not a particularly good interviewer. There's no reason to take off points for a missing semicolon. And finally, a lot of interviewers, we show up with a bad attitude. We show up expecting the candidate to fail, or wanting to look smart in front of the candidate, or expecting the candidate to be better than us. And it ends up coming across to the candidate like you're just there to show off. You don't actually care about helping them get the job, or even if they're going to get the job. So bad questions, bad evaluations, and bad attitudes. These, I would assert, are why tech interviews actually suck. Not necessarily the method, but these more fundamental things that apply to all of the methods. Luckily, we can fix this. We can ask better questions. We can do a better job of evaluation, and we can show up as interviewers with better attitudes. And if we fix it, it doesn't matter what the method is, whether you're doing a whiteboarding or a pairing interview or a portfolio review, fixing all of these things will fix all of those types of interviews. And best of all, most of these are changes you as an individual can make. They don't require buy-in from your HR team. They don't require buy-in from anyone else, because they're all about what happens when you are in the room with a candidate. And you don't have to do any prep. You can make these changes tomorrow. So let's dig in. How do we ask better questions? Okay, first off, keep it simple. So many interview questions and take-home exercises are long and wordy. People aren't at their best in an interview. So cut them some slack. Your actual problem statement should be a single sentence, maybe 2 tops. To check and see if I've gotten my question simple enough, I use a format something like this. Write a function that takes input X, does Y, and returns Z. So I don't actually always give the candidate the question in this format, but I do make sure that whatever question I'm asking could be put into this format. And when I was a new interviewer, I frequently actually did ask questions in this format to make sure that I was asking simple, clear questions. So here's an example using palindrome detection. So write a function that takes a string, checks if it's a palindrome, and returns true or false. Okay, in that format. I could also just ask, write a palindrome checker, but if I do that, I need to be prepared for clarifying questions. Am I checking palindromes on strings? Does capitalization matter? How do I return whether it's a palindrome or not? Do you want me to print something out? Do you want me to return true or false? So if you're going to ask a super simplified version of the question without clear inputs and outputs, you need to be willing to answer that for the candidate. There's nothing wrong with a super simple question as long as you are willing to answer. Don't make the candidate guess what you're thinking. I'll also state right now that it's fine if your question seems super easy. Folks aren't at their best during interviews. One of my current go-to technical questions is actually the first question from the first chapter of an intro computing book for non-computer scientists. And I get plenty of signals about design approaches, data structures, code clarity, etc., even with that simple chapter 1, question 1 type problem. Other things that you need to do, and you need to avoid jargon. Questions with lots of jargon are bad questions. And what do I mean by jargon? So there's obvious stuff like slang terms or terms internal to your team. I worked at a company that we didn't talk about instantiating classes, we talked about newing them up. While most candidates would have been able to figure out what I meant with by newing them up, it was still better in an interview situation to use the appropriate actual term, instantiate, or better yet, create an object of this class. But jargon isn't just slang and internal terms to your team. It can actually go deeper than that. So this is one of my favorite examples of sneaky places where jargon can weasel into a question. So this is a JSON object that describes my very large cat. So what do you call the name of the native data structure in your language that acts like this? So in Python, it's a dictionary. In Ruby, it's a hash. Apparently in PHP, it's an array. In Java, it's a hash map. In Go, it's a map. I'm running out of fingers. In Lisp, and the Lisp language is an associative array. In Lua, it's a table. So it depends a lot on the language what we call a key value store. So if you say your input is an array or a hash, your candidate may actually have a different understanding of the word. So how can you address this? Well, you can give an example, like I just did. A good way to avoid jargon, if you can, or to make sure that your jargon is clear if you can't fully avoid it, is to give examples. Another way that questions are frequently bad is that they use an unfamiliar context. So I recommend that you use a familiar context. And this is actually a way to avoid jargon as well. So here's a potential interview questions. Given a DNA sequence, write a function that determines the most common nucleobase. Totally valid question. It's actually relatively simple. But if you don't know biology, this is going to be super hard. So we're talking about avoiding jargon and talking about avoiding jargon, I could just be able to give an example. So given this DNA sequence, return the character A. I personally think this is enough to make it approachable. And I tried this for a really long time, but I found that a lot of people, if I even mentioned biology or mentioned sports or something, would completely melt down, even with an example like this that they should be able to decipher. So let's be fair to folks. We've avoided jargon, we've added an example, but we still have got a lot of jargon. So what can we do? We can use a familiar context. In this case, we're going to use a context of voting. Given a list of votes, determine who won an election. This is a pretty familiar and almost universally understood context, and it's actually exactly the same problem. Or here, let's take it out of context completely and just leave it as a straight up function. Write a function that determines the most common character in a string. So it's the exact same problem as the first problem using biology, but this is significantly more approachable because I have taken all the context out and I'm making it easier for folks to understand as a result. So you can avoid jargon and use a familiar context, and those two together will frequently make it so that your candidate is significantly more successful. So here's some context that I've seen be problematic for folks. So sports and games are often problematic. Pretty much anything specific to your industry, unless industry knowledge is an absolute requirement, and even then tread carefully. And both of these are like, well, if I present the rules of the game or the rules of the sport or the information they need about the industry, it should be enough. No, it's not. It should be, I agree. My experience tells me that it's not. Don't use sports and game contexts, even if you provide all the rules. One of the reasons that it could be a problem is that some games have different names in different countries. Some sports have different names in different countries. And then my last sneaky context that people don't think about is math. They're like, oh, if I just ask a math problem or, base something in math, it'll be easy. No, actually it's not. First of all, a lot of people freeze on math, and you're not going to be able to accurately assess their coding abilities if they've frozen because you've thrown in a, if else something for math in there. Necessary and sufficient conditions, if and only if, that kind of thing. But the other problem you're going to run into is, I'm just going to use kindergarten math, I'm just going to use, third grade math, is that actually in a lot of different countries, basic arithmetic is taught differently. I once worked at a company that did education software, and we spent a 45-minute meeting working with some folks from another country discussing an algorithm, discussing the standard multiplication algorithm, and we realized toward the end of the meeting that we had just had a 45-minute meeting, and we were both using different definitions of the standard multiplication algorithm. don't use math. Math is not going to be a universal and familiar context the way you might think it would be. So another thing that you can do is make sure that your questions are relevant to the job description. Don't ask questions about memory management for a front-end web job. I've been asked that. It did not go well for me and it made me angry. Don't ask back-end folks about JavaScript and CSS. That's not what they need for the position. Even if that is your favorite question, they're not going to do well on it. And mostly, don't ask folks to implement common data structures and algorithms unless you want to work with someone who rolls their own hash table. You don't. You don't want to work with someone who rolls their own hash table. So let's stop asking people to implement common data structures and algorithms. And damn it, no riddles and tricks. Brain teasers and such are not actually relevant to your job. Knowing why manhole covers are round, not relevant to your job. Being able to estimate how many ping pong balls fits in a 747, not actually relevant to the job. A lot of people argue that these are good ways of seeing how people approach problems, how they estimate, things like that. Fine, pick a situation that is actually relevant to your job. I got asked a question at one of my jobs, is how would you roll out an upgrade of all of our laptops? That was significantly more relevant to the job, although I'd argue still not relevant to the job. Actually, it was a question that one of my friends was asked, and they were asked, if you were in charge of HR, how would you increase the diversity of our teams? They were interviewing for an HR position, not relevant to the job. There's other ways to get information about how users solve, or how people solve problems, how people interact, how people think about important issues. Just ask the freaking question as it relates to the job. We don't need brain teasers. And then another tip for asking questions, and this is not even about bad questions, this is just to improve everyone's success, is to ask your question both out loud and in writing. Currently, for any technical question I have that I ask a candidate, I read it out loud, but I also give it to the candidate in writing. Right now, that means I'm copying and pasting it into a shared document so they can read it. I personally do better with the spoken word, but a lot of folks seem to do better with writing, and having the written version there means that they have something to refer back to as they're thinking through, as they're checking their work, etc. Giving both options doesn't take me any extra time, and it does increase the success of the candidates in my experience. This one's a bit more subtle, but it's important that you don't over-specify. And what do I mean by over-specify? Here's an example of a question that's too specific. So, calculate the winner of election. Handle ties by selecting the first candidate. Handle invalid inputs by prompting the user for clarification. It may seem like it's useful to provide information about these edge cases, but in my experience, this is just too much upfront for most candidates. Some folks will never actually get to the edge cases because they're going to struggle enough. And so providing that info to them upfront is actually a distraction. And often, if you're overly specific, you actually have an implementation in mind, and you may be preventing the candidate from using other equally valid solutions. So how do you handle things like edge cases then? Well, encourage the candidate to ask questions. So you can say, hey, this is the problem. I'm sure that I didn't specify how to handle some edge cases. So when you hit those, let's talk about them. If you do that, you also get information about whether the candidate can identify the edge cases and potential problems in your specification. And that's useful data to have. My favorite way of handling edge cases right now is the candidate identifies the edge case, and then I ask them for their opinion about how we should handle it. Because that gives me information about, is the candidate willing to have an opinion about a design, and can they back that opinion up with, preferences, facts, whatever they choose to back it up with. It lets me see if we can have a discussion about design points. But mostly, going back to the first thing to make your questions better, keep it short and simple. The most common failure mode for questions I see is folks asking something that's too complex or too hard. And what do I mean by short? I recommend 1 hour max for a whiteboard question. I try to keep mine at 30 to 45 minutes for most candidates, because that gives me time to ask other questions, behavioral questions, and also gives the candidate time to ask me questions. And I recommend, 2 to 3 hours max if you're going to do a homework problem or a coding task. And that 3 hours is, in my opinion, really pushing it. 2 hours seems completely fair and should be enough for you to get the data you need. I'm also going to just throw in an extra tip here. If you choose to do homework assignments, give folks the option of doing it on site in a quiet place that you provide. Not everyone's home life will give them a chance to do it at home. So you can say, hey, you're welcome to do this at home. Or once COVID is over, you can say, or you can come in to your on-site interview a little bit earlier And we'll set you up with a conference room and a laptop if you don't want to bring your own, and you can work here, and we'll be available to help you out. So if you're having trouble estimating how long something will take, and this is super common from new interviewers, here's a rule of thumb I've used. Give the candidate 3 times as long as it would take you or a friend to complete and type up and test the problem. The added stress of an interview and explaining your work adds overhead that we don't account for. And frequently, if you're writing the problem, you have a solution in mind, so it's going to go faster for you anyway. So you don't want to give a candidate for a 45-minute interview something that will take you longer than 15 minutes to type up. Ideally, something you should give them even more time, but no less than 3x the amount of time it took you or a friend to solve it. Okay, so that was all the stuff on how to ask better questions. Let's go into better evaluation, because better questions don't actually help if your evaluation is still kind of crappy. A lot of candidates are actually really worried, more than the method of interview, more than the type of questions. They're just worried their interviewer will be a hard grader, or that the interviewers won't evaluate consistently. So how can we get better at evaluating? Well, there's one primary way: rubrics. Have a rubric. If you're unfamiliar with the term rubric, it's a rating guide that uses broad categories and includes examples for each rating. Most big tech companies that I know have used rubrics at this point, but in addition to the rubric that I get from Google, I've also written rubrics for my most common questions to help me be consistent in how I evaluate people's answers. And I actually have them available for other people if they're going to use my questions, or for them to verify how I'm grading. So let's say your job description includes the phrase knows Python. So this might be your rubric. We've got 4 categories on the side: strong, solid, borderline, and not present. And for strong, we have the description: demonstrated knowledge of basic and advanced Python syntax, demonstrated knowledge of many classes and data structures in the standard library, and when to use them, and proactively explain trade-offs between different approaches when there was more than one way to complete a task. Also, code is consistently Pythonic. For solid, we may have demonstrated knowledge of common Python syntax, demonstrated knowledge of common classes and data structures in the standard library, could come up with alternate approaches if prompted, used idiomatic approaches most of the time, and errors were minor and the candidate was able to effectively use hints to correct any errors. Borderline would be something like demonstrated knowledge of basic Python syntax, may not have used more advanced concepts like list comprehensions, may have made medium-sized errors but could correct them if pointed out by the interviewer, demonstrated knowledge of some parts of the standard library but needed hints and reminders, and code is not consistently Pythonic. And then for not present, we would have a rubric of something like struggled with basic Python syntax and was unable to correct errors when pointed out, demonstrated limited understanding of the standard library and struggled even if hints were provided. Code is not idiomatic and may look like another language. And so candidates that don't know Python at all will struggle with even the basic syntax. And they may write Python that looks like Java or C. I've read a great deal of Ruby that looks like C, and Java that looks like Lisp, and lots of other things. So this gives you kind of an idea of what a rubric might look like, and it helps you decide upfront what you actually need from a candidate. But I'm also going to call it explicitly the rubric, the one I just went over, is qualitative, not quantitative. A lot of folks have a tendency to make an interview points-based, as in they'll say things like, they had 3 syntax errors in their whiteboard code. I take off 1 point for each of those, which leaves them a 2 out of 5. No. This isn't basketball. Don't do points. Evaluate the candidate as a whole, and ideally evaluate the candidate against a predetermined rubric. Another technique to help you write better interview feedback and evaluate more fairly is to question yourself. This helps you clarify your thinking, and it also is good for counteracting a number of cognitive biases like recency bias and anchoring bias. If you question yourself and you think through and you ask yourself questions while you're typing up or saying your feedback out loud. So my 2 favorite questions are ones I actually learned at Google, and I really, really like, and they work well when paired with a rubric. If your rubric has 4 different buckets, solid, strong, borderline, and not present, and you've picked solid for the candidate, you can then ask yourself, well, why didn't I pick the higher bucket? Why didn't I pick strong? And then you also ask yourself, well, why didn't I pick the lower bucket? Why didn't I pick borderline? And for a lot of stuff, when I write up interview feedback, I'll put a sentence for each of these 2. Why not higher? Why not lower? I think of this as checking my work and making sure that I'm not applying cognitive bias or, using how much I enjoyed talking to the candidate, or, if they used my favorite approach for their coding problem versus another one that was equally valid, but I don't like as much. Why not higher? Why not lower? If you work at a company that also makes you suggest a level for the candidate, you can also use this as a leveling function. Some other questions you can ask yourself as you give your hiring recommendation. Can the candidate clearly explain their technical decisions? A lot of folks don't remember that ability to communicate about technical stuff is actually super important, in addition to just knowing how to code. Did the candidate consider common error and race conditions? That's a valid thing to ask. And then one that I really think is important that I don't think people ask often enough is, how did the candidate handle feedback or hints? If you have to give feedback, hey, you missed something there, or hey, I don't think you got the variable names quite right, or you seem to have an unused variable. Did they take it and, take the feedback, fix the code? Or were they argumentative and combative about it? That's good data to have, because it's useful data to know if you're going to be working with this person long term. And here's one more question I ask myself a lot. Does it matter? If a candidate misses a semicolon on their whiteboard code, before ding them for it, ask yourself, does it matter? No, probably not. They're never going to be actually coding on a whiteboard. The IDE or the compiler would catch it for them anyway. If a candidate doesn't have deep knowledge of your industry, and this is for an entry-level position, does it actually matter? No, it might be a bonus for a candidate who does know about your industry, but it's certainly not a requirement. So I wouldn't necessarily take points off a candidate, and again, not points, but I wouldn't necessarily evaluate a candidate lower because they lacked some specific industry knowledge, because it doesn't actually matter. And related to does it matter, and what helps me make decisions about what does and doesn't matter, is that I assume there's going to be some ramp up time. I assume, based on the company I work at, somewhere between a month and 6 months, depending on your company's standard for ramp up, before we're going to expect high quality work out of a candidate. So if a candidate makes a mistake, as I'm asking myself, does it actually matter? I'm like, is this something that we can address during their ramp up? Like, is this something like lack of industry knowledge that we can address in those first couple months and help them get up to speed, and then it's not going to be a big issue? Yep. If so, maybe it doesn't matter. So I don't know if there's research on this, but I've actually found that it helps me a lot to use gender neutral pronouns when I write out my feedback. I happen to have mostly worked at companies where we actually do our feedback in a written form, as opposed to all getting in a meeting and voting in real time. So by gender neutral pronouns, I mean things like they, them in English. And originally I thought this was actually to prevent bias in like the hiring manager who was reading my interview notes. But now that I've done it for several years, I've found that it's actually more for me, the interviewer, who's writing up the feedback, because it helps me be more objective and avoid gendered terms like bossy or command presence or other, different ways we use terms that have implications based on the gender of the candidate. If using gender neutral pronouns feels too hard, first of all, I'd say writing up interview feedback that no one other than the hiring manager is going to read seems like a fantastic place to practice your they-thems. But if not, there are actually Chrome plugins. I searched for a couple. One of them was autocorrect her, that will identify gendered language and suggest alternatives. I keep one of these on, and it only works on the site where I write up interview feedback, and it's super duper helpful because it helps me avoid unclear things. It helps point out places where I'm using gendered language, and it helps you just write better feedback. So that was some stuff about better evaluation. So we've done better questions, we've done better evaluation, and now for the most important one, better attitudes. This is where the hazing in the talk title comes from. People come to interviews with bad attitudes all the time. And one of the ones that I think we don't say out loud, but we seem to act on a lot is, well, this is how I was interviewed for this position and it sucked. So, you have to go through it too. Clearly, if I was interviewed for this position that way, it's the right way to interview. Or the candidate must know more than me about AI. Or my job is to ensure that only the best get through our hiring process. Or one that I have in the past all candidates lie, and it's my job to figure out where the candidate is lying. No, it just puts you in a sour mood, and it doesn't help the candidate at all. I've made a pretty big change in my approach in the last couple of years to starting with positivity. I go into every interview with a positive attitude. And I don't mean just be friendly. Of course, be friendly. I mean, I try to go into every single interview expecting it to go well. I expect that I'm going to recommend that we hire the candidate. I'm not going to go into the interview assuming that the candidate's not going to pass. And just that simple change of mindset has helped a lot, and has helped how the candidates view in my interviews a lot. And I actually really like referring to this as being on team the candidate. I am there to make the candidate look good. I want the interview process to go well because I want all the candidates to succeed, because then we can stop interviewing and I can move on with life. It doesn't mean I want to hire everyone, because clearly I want to make good hiring decisions. But I want to make sure that I'm going in and giving every candidate the best possible chance at success. So if you want a candidate to succeed and you're on team the candidate, you should probably be helpful. People worry that being helpful will lead to hiring bad candidates, but my experience says that that doesn't happen. And there's a couple reasons for that. First, no job requires that you work alone all the time without help. I bounce ideas off my coworkers all the time. When I was working in consulting and writing code most of the day, all of my code got code reviews. If I was struggling with something, I could just lean over and ask the next guy over how to solve it. And second, if you're helpful to everyone, you are still going to be evaluating against a common baseline. So if everyone's getting hints, if everyone's getting assistance with syntax from you, you're still evaluating against the same common baseline. So it's not like you're going to give an advantage to one candidate over another. And how you can be helpful, I actually like offering suggestions. I've actually called them suggestions instead of hints on purpose. You can give suggestions if the candidate is going down the wrong path or misunderstood a question. And I like saying suggestions because hints imply that there's a single valid answer. And for most coding problems, there's not. And if your coding problem has a single valid answer, I'd suggest that it might actually be a riddle or a brain teaser disguised as a coding problem. And I make it clear. I'm like, hey, you may not want to take this advice, but I think you have a mistake, in line 7 or something. Like, that's how I offer it. It's the same way I'd work with a coworker. And if you can't do suggestions in real time because you're doing it as a homework assignment, or having someone actually do a real coding exercise in your office, you can still actually offer suggestions. I did an not take home, but at their office coding exercise for about 5 hours at a company once. And as part of the process, they designated an employee my phone a friend resource. I was actually nervous as all get out because I'd never had an interview where I actually had to code on a machine on site. I was using a different keyboard layout than I was used to. It was a mess. I forgot how to write the syntax to create a new class in C++. Like, I couldn't even get started. So I picked up the phone and phoned the employee that they had made my phone a friend. And I'm like, hey, I can't code this. He came down, reminded me of the syntax, and was able to get me rolling. And I ended up getting an offer. And I thought it was a really good time for them to show, hey, we can offer suggestions and help. We're not going to evaluate you for forgetting things and making stupid mistakes if you can take suggestions and move on. And it was significantly realistic, because if I took the job there, if I had a job there, I would have been able to ask for help if I got stuck, if I had a brain fart. And if you're on team the candidate, it also makes sense to focus on the candidate's strengths, not their weaknesses. So what does a strengths-focused interview look like? It means you don't dwell on mistakes, even major ones. I actually tell candidates up front in almost all of my interviews now, hey, I'm here to figure out what you do know, not what you don't know. So if you don't know something, tell me up front. We'll either talk about it, I'll try to rephrase the question in a way that makes more sense, or we'll just move on. And you know what? Usually I just move on, even if it's a multi-part question where I was hoping it would take 45 or 30 minutes of my 45 minutes, I go to another one. If for some reason I can't just move on, I'll help the candidate get past the mistake so that we can do part B. Either I'll, provide them the code, or I'll heavily suggest and assist them in getting there. Or, I'll drive for a bit and give them the code, and then I'll let them take over for part B. But really just move on. I've read some feedback from interviews before where someone missed a question super early on, and the interviewer just kept hammering on that question and variations on it. It was clear the candidate didn't know anything about the topic, but they subjected them to it anyway, and it just made me sad for the candidate. Don't do that. Don't dwell on mistakes. Accept I don't know. Just accept I don't know. And you're like, well, I can't accept I don't know because they have to know this. Okay, well, accept I don't know and then ask, okay, cool. I understand you don't know. Let's say that this is a thing you have to find out for the job here. How would you learn? That gives you data about, can the candidate get unstuck themselves? And it also tells you something about their learning style, and you can find out if that's a learning style that you guys can actually support. And then when I talk about focusing on strengths, sometimes people say, but what if they just don't have the skills needed for this position? Okay, sure, it happens. Sometimes you can cut them loose halfway through, hey, this isn't going well. We're gonna let you go a little early. And it's sad for the candidate, but at least you're not wasting their time and making them look like an idiot all day. But if you work at a big enough company, I actually believe it's worth poking around and figuring out what they are good at. Because, maybe there's another position that they'd be successful in a different role, or maybe on a different team. Part of the reason my fourth set of interviews at Google went so well was because I was interviewing for the right role for me. If my earlier interviewers had identified the fact that I was close, but not quite there for the role I interviewed for, but maybe this other role would be appropriate, I could have actually done better earlier on. So time for a lightning round. We're gonna go through my last tips and tricks. First part of lightning round, people need to eat. Make sure that you don't make a candidate go more than a couple hours without food. Ideally, you should be providing food. But now that we're doing a lot of take-home interviews, I've seen a lot of recruiters scheduling them back to back to back. Keep the candidate's time zone in mind and make sure that they get a break to eat every couple hours at least. Also, people need to drink. On-site interviews, you should be offering water at least, maybe another beverage. Again, if you're doing interviews from home, make sure people have a chance to go refill their coffee cup. People need to pee. Give chance for a bio break. Make sure that people have a chance to go to the bathroom. Some people need to pump. Some people need to pump fresh milk, or if we're doing these COVID interviews from home, maybe they need an hour break in between interviews to go nurse their kiddo. Make sure that you are able to accommodate that, because it's just fair. And I just said the word accommodate. There are likely legal requirements about what kind of accommodations you need to offer for disabilities. Please talk to your lawyer. I am not your lawyer. This is going to vary somewhat by country, or significantly by country, and somewhat by state or province within your country, most likely. You can always offer more accommodations than are legally required, but there are some that you absolutely 100% have to offer. And speaking of offer, you can, if you can do it, offer coaching. And like when I say coaching, people are like, well, I can't teach them how to do the job. I'm like, no, that's not what I mean by coaching. What I mean by coaching is giving people a chance to do one interview as a dry run that doesn't count with a sympathetic interviewer, so that they get used to the format that you're going to be expecting of them. So they get a chance to ask questions about the format, to ask questions about how they did, so you can give them tips about explaining their work better, things like that. Often, if you've got junior interviewers, this can be a good way for them to practice their interviewing skills as well, because they can get a chance to do more interviews and with some of them that don't count. We also have some of our more experienced interviewers do this when we do offer coaching. So if you can offer coaching, offer coaching. Be human. Offer a bit of yourself, not too much, but don't be a robot. You don't want to tell them all about your marital problems, but you want to be kind, mention some things that you like, be an actual human. It tends to put people a little at ease if you do that. Related though, do not ask personal questions. And this seems super obvious when I phrase it this way, but people often ask personal questions to be nice and friendly. And it actually often backfires, and it tends to backfire more with members of underrepresented groups. So unrelated to underrepresented groups, but even seemingly innocent questions like, have you read any good books lately? Can make someone stressed out if they haven't had a chance to read lately because they've been working 3 jobs to make ends meet. Keep friendly questions which you are allowed to ask focused on the job. Like, what are you most excited about working here? Or, we use blah, blah, blah software. Have you used that before? Keep them, or even things like, well, my favorite part of working here is what kind of things are you looking forward to? There's lots of ways you can ask friendly questions that aren't personal, and you keep stuff related to the job so the candidate feels better about it. So summary. So summary and a cheat sheet. So tips for asking better questions. Keep it simple. Avoid jargon. Use a familiar context. Don't over-specify. Encourage questions from the candidate. Give your question both written and verbally, and keep it short. Again, no more than 45 minutes to an hour for a whiteboard question, ideally less than 3 hours for a homework problem. Tips for better evaluations. Use a rubric. Question yourself. Ask questions like, why not higher? Why not lower? Ask questions like, does it matter if the candidate missed this thing? Assume that you're going to have some ramp up time so that you don't have to assess the candidate and ask them to be perfect. And use gender neutral language like they and them, or use a tool that will help you avoid gendered language in your write-ups if you can't use gender neutral language. And some tips for better attitudes. Be on team the candidate. Be helpful, be nice, be kind, be friendly, but mostly be on team the candidate. Help the candidate out, offer suggestions, and focus hard on the candidate's strengths, not on their weaknesses. Figure out what they're good at. Don't go into the interview figuring out what they're lying about or what they're bad at. So, and from the lightning round, biology happens. People need to eat and drink. People need to eliminate. People might need to pump or nurse. Offer accommodations, offer coaching, be human, and don't ask personal questions. Thank you very much.